HB 608 by Representative Wilder.
Yes, sir. Ready to go?
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, can I make a motion?
Okay, Representative Turner for a motion.
Hey, I'd like to make a motion to start a 3-minute rule.
Any objection to in stating the 3-minute rule? Seeing no objection, the 3-minute rule is in adoption. All testimony will be limited to 3 minutes today. Good morning, Representative Wilder.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Hang on. Mics.
Okay, on your bill, HB 608.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee. I'm here today to bring House Bill 608, the Women's Safety and Protection Act. I was asked by constituents in my district to bring this bill because of an incident that happened in my district. We had a specific occurrence at a public facility where a biological male demanded access to the female changing rooms, locker rooms, and showers, spaces that are designated and occupied by women and young girls. The officials declined to allow it, citing their desire to protect the trusted privacy and safety of our women and daughters. There were then mentions and threats of legal action where the employees feared that they may be sued individually. We've heard of situations like this happening in other parts of the country where young women are humiliated, frightened, and/or made to feel vulnerable by policies that allow males to use their locker rooms, restrooms, and overnight lodging. And now this situation is happening in our state and happened in my district. Thus, I was asked to bring this bill. I promised my constituents, I promised the women in my district and across our state, and I promised my wife and my little girl that I would bring this bill. Our intent is to send a clear message that Louisiana will preserve the privacy, dignity, and safety of its women and girls. One of the primary duties of government is to provide for the basic public safety and welfare of our citizens. That includes protecting the most vulnerable places such as locker rooms, restrooms, changing rooms, but also places such as detention centers and domestic violence shelters. We must defend the dignity, safety, and welfare of all women. I'm standing for the basic understanding that there are biological differences between females and males that create the need for separate privacy spaces for said females and males, something that has been accepted as commonplace since time immemorial. Again, this bill's goal is to put women first by affording them confidence in their privacy and safety in their female-only use areas. Women must know that they are truly protected from vulnerability of intrusion, embarrassment, trauma, or unfortunately, in worst cases, situations of assault or even physical harm. 10 other states have already taken this step to protect privacy for biological females, including Arkansas, Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, and Oklahoma, to name a few. It is time for Louisiana to step up and ensure that every woman in our state has the same protections in place. For my district, for all of Louisiana, this bill ensures that our private spaces in our schools, women's shelters, prisons, domestic violence shelters, etc., remain safe spaces for everyone. I will take questions.
Thank you, Representative Wilder. We also have the Attorney General in the committee today. Would you like to offer some testimony?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm predominantly here to support the bill and to answer any legal questions that you have. I think that it is a good bill, and I, too, have had a family member in high school who's been subjected to having to share private spaces for women that without being afforded any opportunity to even express any opposition to it. So, I think that it's become a problem. We did litigate this issue in 2016 when Governor Edwards issued an executive order, and I obtained a ruling from the First Circuit Court of Appeal that acknowledged that we have over 700 laws in our state that use the term male, female, boy, girl, father, mother, and that they are based on an understanding of biological gender as the basis for the meaning of those terms, and that at that time the executive order couldn't make law by executive order and change the meaning of those words. I believe that's true at the federal government level as well, and so I'm just here to answer any concerns that you may have, legal concerns, and to show my support for the bill.
Thank you, Attorney General. Welcome to the to the civil law today, and thanks for bringing Larry Freeman with you today. The board is clear, so we'll take a few testimonies in support. We have, well, let's go ahead and introduce yourself before we start that.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Matt Sharp. I'm senior counsel with Alliance Defending Freedom.
Thank you. So we have Pam Roselli here representing herself and wishing to speak. If we could clear the table and let these parties testify. Kim Sport, United Against Domestic Violence, present wishing to speak. And Matt Sharp, Alliance Defending Freedom, wishing to speak. Okay.
How do I take a seat?
Yeah. Have a seat, miss.
I just have something really short to say.
Well, ma'am, introduce yourself.
I'm Pamela Roselli. I live in Madisonville, Louisiana, and I just have a little short something to say.
Pull your mic a little closer. We're having trouble hearing you.
Sure. I just want to say this, that children shouldn't be deciding if they want to be a boy or girl. God already did that for them. And I thank y'all for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Roselli. We like that kind of testimony.
Am I
there
on?
you go.
Hi.
You got it.
Okay. Chairman Muscarello, my name is Kim Sport. I am been working with United Against Domestic Violence for the past 10 years or so. I just want to call the committee's attention to the fact that domestic violence shelters are indeed included in this bill. And I think you know that last year, the legislature, for the first time, on the strong recommendation of the legislative auditor, recommended that the state provide in its budget $7 million in funding to adequately cover the needed domestic violence services that we provide in Louisiana. That's currently not in the budget. We're hoping that it will be put back in. This bill, and I think very unintentionally, is going to jeopardize even more funding for domestic violence shelters in the sense that the federal government, that domestic violence shelters are not going to be able to be eligible for federal government grants in the amount of up to about $18 million if this bill is passed in its current form. So I know that there are others coming behind me who are going to
So
ask.
you're a red card, I'm assuming.
No, I'm providing, I thought I had a white card on this.
Okay.
I thought I had a white card. Did
That's
I
all
put the wrong number on my green and white cards? I'm sorry if I did. I should have a green card for 787 and a white card for 608.
We'll figure it out. I just
Okay,
wanna-
but anyway, I know that experts in this area are going to be coming up to the table asking that domestic violence shelters be removed from this because there are already protections in place based on gender. And this is almost essentially going to put domestic violence shelters out of business in Louisiana if that terminology stays in. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Sport. I got you. Let me just call Gene Mills while he's here, and then we do have some, Ms. Sport, we have some questions for you. Representative Edmonston for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ma'am, I'm sorry, I forgot your last name.
Sport, S-P-O-R-T.
Okay, Ms. Sport. What is already in place? You said something's already in place, so there would be no need for us to include this in the bill. So can you tell me what's in place already?
Right. Well, there are many screenings which take place when someone is requesting a safe bed or housing within a domestic violence shelter.
Did you say screenings?
Yes, yes.
What kind of screening?
Mariah Wineski is going to come up. She is the chairman of the Louisiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
Okay.
And I know she's going to answer all of those questions. But for many years, there have been concerns about whether children over a certain age, particularly male children, can be allowed into domestic violence shelters. There are safety plans in place, and I'm going to let Mariah testify on that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Mr. Chair.
Representative, for your question.
That's all the questions, Mr. Sport. We do have Gene Mills with the Louisiana Family Forum. Welcome to the civil law. Gene.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. It's an honor to be with you this morning to deal with this subject matter. What is a woman? That question has been bouncing around America, and it's landed here in Louisiana. HB 608 answers that question and protects women from unscientific and political applications of so-called gender ideology. HB 608 brings some common sense to a debate that has been highly charged. HB 608 simply echoes a biological reality of male and female. And by the way, on the question of funding for domestic abuse shelters, I believe the author is going to address that question, but the 18 or so million dollars that are in question are more than amply able to be offset if for some reason there's any real threat for doing what common sense, history, and precedent has told you is the right thing to do today. And that's what I'm going to encourage you to do today. While most Americans understand that a woman is an adult female, we have seen progressive redefinition of women subjected to state and unrelated to biological sex. It has become increasingly difficult to talk about woman in a common vernacular or language. This is not just a problem of semantics. The corruption of biological identity hijacks and robs opportunity, privacy, safety, and freedom of expression. By maintaining a person's identity as determined at conception and genetically, HB 608 clarifies the meaning of laws, sex discrimination, and preserves single-sex spaces. This is important for privacy, safety, and equal opportunity. HB 608 provides an objective scientific standard by asserting that sex means individual biology, either male or female. Gender identity and other politically charged terms simply do not apply and should not be used as substitute for sex in state law. 608 simply clarifies the meaning of sex, male, female, and related terms within state law and provides protection for women, girls, and children. I ask you to favorably pass this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Mills. We have no questions. The board is clear. We do have some cards.
Mr. Chairman, you did have a member from Matt Sharp, who you called earlier, here from Alliance Defending Freedom.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I'm Matt Sharp, Senior Counsel with Alliance Defending Freedom. Our law firm has represented women and women's facilities that have been harmed by policies that allow men into women's-only spaces. Women deserve to have their privacy and dignity safeguarded in spaces where they're most vulnerable. As even the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg put it, quote, "Separate places to disrobe, sleep, and perform personal bodily functions are permitted and in some cases required by the need for individual privacy," end quote. And unfortunately, we're seeing men who assert a female identity being allowed to invade private spaces for women, like showers, restrooms, sleeping quarters, and changing areas. Take, for example, what happened to our client, Downtown Hope Center in Anchorage, which offers its daytime services to everyone but limits its overnight sleeping facilities to women, some of whom are fleeing domestic violence and even trafficking. One night, a heavily intoxicated man who identified as a woman showed up at the women's shelter, demanded to be allowed to sleep there. Seeing that he was injured, the Hope Center paid for a taxi to take him to a local hospital to get the medical care he needed, but it would not allow him to sleep in the women's-only facility because the mattresses are spaced just feet apart, and the center wanted to make sure that the emotional, physiological, and physical needs of the women it serves were protected. Next thing you know, the local Civil Rights Commission filed a lawsuit against the Downtown Hope Center simply for trying to prioritize the needs of the women it serves. We're seeing these harms expand to public schools, where a male wearing a skirt sexually assaulted a female student in the girls' bathroom in Loudoun County, Virginia. An 18-year-old male student who identifies as female exposed himself to a 14-year-old girl student in Wisconsin. And a school in Colorado tried to force an 11-year-old girl to share a bed with a male student on a school overnight field trip. The situation is even worse in California, where the state began allowing men who identify as women to transfer to women's correctional facilities. These women are now forced to shower in front of these men, share a cell, endure verbal harassment, and even physical and sexual harassment. In fact, within just 2 years of California doing this policy, the state had nearly 400 transfer requests from men requesting to be moved to the women's prison. A state report detailed the harm of this that it was causing to incarcerated women, with several women voicing voicing concerns about the physical and verbal assaults that they were facing. As one of the women described it, quote, "There are a lot of wolves in sheep's clothing that are happening here." HB 608 would work to protect Louisiana women by ensuring that women's-only spaces at schools, shelters, prisons, and other places are not open to men. Whether it's on an overnight school trip or in a state-funded shelter or correctional facility, no woman should be required to share a bed, restroom, or changing area with a male. Thank you.
Good timing, Mr. I forget your last name. Sharp?
Sharp, yes, sir.
Good timing, Mr. Sharp. Okay, no questions. The board is clear. We have some cards in support but not wishing to speak. Laura Huber, Concerned Women for America. Raylene of Avocado, same group. Mary Ravel, same group. Aaron Shotan. Cheryl McCoy. And Cheryl Broussard-Perret. Let's see. We also have present wishing to speak. Okay, excuse me, not wishing to speak. Family Forum, Kathleen Benfield and Connie Hare, State Freedom Caucus Network. Okay, that is all the cards in support. We also have present and wishing to speak, white card, Mariah Wineski. Before we start, we have an amendment. Let's see, it's amendment set 2395. Ms. Alonzo, can you please read that into the record?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, this is Amendment Set 2395. Amendments numbers 1, 2, and 3 are technical in nature. Amendment number 4 on page 8, line 1, changes a female to any person. Amendment number 4 on page 8, line 14, changes biological females to an individual. And amendment number 6 on page 8, line 15, changes biological males to members of the opposite sex.
The chair will offer the amendment. Any objection to the adoption of the amendment? Seeing no objection, the amendment is adopted. Ma'am.
Good morning. My name is Mariah Wineski. I'm the director of the Louisiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and we are the statewide network of domestic violence shelters. So I just wanted to come and provide a little more context to what Kim Sport had said and kind of bring the committee's attention to the impact that this would have on domestic violence shelters specifically in Louisiana. So there are 17 domestic violence shelters in Louisiana, and unlike the other entities that are named in the bill, the domestic violence shelters operate as small independent nonprofits, and they contract with DCFS. So DCFS does not manage the daily operations of the shelters. So historically, as Ms. Sport said, Louisiana has not funded domestic violence shelters with state dollars, and so that makes them very, very, very reliant on the federal funding that they receive. So their funding situation is also very precarious. They don't have a large pool of funds to draw from. They basically have only their federal grants and donations, and then a few, private foundation grants if they're lucky to get those. So the requirements of this bill would put every shelter in direct non-compliance with the requirements of 3 of their largest federal funders, which are HUD, DOJ, and HHS. So all 3 of those entities specifically require shelters to serve victims based on their gender identity, not their biological sex. The shelters did not make those rules, but they're required to follow them, and they have to certify their compliance every year when they reapply for funding. So the bill as written would result, my rough calculations, in the loss of somewhere around $14 million per year in recurring federal funding for the shelters, which again is the vast majority of what they receive. Now, while I don't think that the federal government would come in mid-year and pull their funding because of this, what would happen is that when they go to reapply next year, they would not be able to certify their compliance with those requirements, so they just would no longer be eligible for the funding. So our concern, I guess, is just that this bill would do the opposite of what it was intended by inadvertently shutting down shelters by pulling their federal funding. I do want to note that other states with similar legislation have removed domestic violence shelters from it after realizing that the unintended consequences would outweigh any potential benefit. In addition to jeopardizing the federal funding, it would also put the shelters in a position where they would have to leave beds unused, and we already don't have enough beds to meet the need in our state. So the requirement to designate rooms for male or female, so currently, the shelters already don't house men and women together in shared rooms. They already don't do that. However, if a male victim comes into shelter as a victim of domestic violence, they stay in a room for 45 days. That's your typical shelter stay. They stay in that room, and then their stay is over, they leave. And then the shelter needs to be able to use that room for the next victim that comes in, which very likely is going to be a female victim. But the way that this is written, we would be required to leave that room empty and wait for the next male to come into shelter. So we don't want to be in a position where we're wasting resources.
What do other states do? What are the other states, like Arkansas? Have you researched that?
Yeah, most of the bills in other states have not specifically listed domestic violence shelters. They typically have focused on correctional facilities, public schools, like true public entities. There were some that started out, like Utah and North Dakota, for example, started in a similar format where they listed correctional facilities, schools, and domestic violence shelters. And throughout the process, the domestic violence shelters were amended out of those
And
bills.
there's a protocol in place to prevent this from happening anyway?
Yes, the shelters are all staffed 24/7. Most of them are already set up as individual apartments, so you already have individual housing. But in the ones that are congregate shelters, in a congregate setting, you already don't house men and women in the same room. And then again, you have 24-hour staffing to make sure that nobody's going into the restroom when somebody else is there and those types of things.
And Ms. Cassiopa, why don't you come forward and I'll get you to the table. We do have a question by Representative Edmonston.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, ma'am. This sort of feels like we're being held hostage by the federal government. That's very concerning to me. Would you go back over just like I asked before, the provisions that are in place to keep this kind of thing from happening in the shelters?
Yes. So first is when somebody calls and needs a domestic violence shelter bed, they are screened for eligibility. So it's not like a women's shelter, like a women's homeless shelter, right? So you have to be a victim of domestic violence to be eligible to be housed at a domestic violence shelter. So first they're screened for eligibility, and then when it's found that they are eligible, they come in. Like I said, in most shelters, they're set up to where everybody has their own individual room. Most of the time with an individual bathroom as well. So you think of either an apartment complex or something like a former nursing home setup, right, where they have their own individual.
Let me just stop you and go back to the first one. The screening, is that based on biological sex? Or gender identity when you're going through the screening? And I know you must ask those questions.
Right. It's based on gender identity, and it's required to be based on gender identity.
I realize that. That's problematic.
We can't look.
I understand that. I understand the money. But that's problematic for the people of Louisiana.
I do want to say that we've been adhering, I hear your concerns, we've been adhering to these federal requirements since at least 2016 regarding gender identity, and it hasn't harmed anyone. It has allowed us to serve the most vulnerable among us while also maintaining privacy for everybody and adhering to the federal requirements that we're held to.
Yes, ma'am.
We did talk with our membership, and this is not an issue, this is not a thing that they asked for. In fact, we're begging to be left out of this fight.
Thank you for answering my questions. Thank you, Mr.
Representative
Chair.
Johnson for a question.
Yes, ma'am. I just want to make sure I fully understand what you're telling me. You're telling me that every domestic violence shelter in our state is set up to protect the safety of women
Yes.
from everyone, basically.
Yes.
Is that right?
From their abuser primarily, yes.
Okay, from their abuser primarily. Are there communal restrooms, showers, bathrooms in any of your centers?
There are not communal showers in any of them. Some of them are set up in an old house. So so those are the ones that are the most communal in nature, but even those have private bedrooms and a couple different restrooms. And so in those cases, if you have a male, you might have let's say you have 3 bedrooms in this old house. You might have a family, so a woman with 3 young children living in one of the bedrooms. In another bedroom, you might have 2 or 3 single women bunked together. And then let's say you have a male in shelter, which is also very rare, right? But let's say you do have a male in shelter. Well, they would be in that third restroom or in that third bedroom. And then the 24-hour staff would ensure that there are assigned shower times, for example, that nobody's entering the restroom or each other's rooms. So it's not just a free-for-all in these shelters. They're staffed and they're well secured.
I'm familiar, having served with Hope House in Alexandria that used to be an old house, now moved into, or some time ago moved into an old nursing home. But I'm concerned even in that center where someone, a male who identified as a woman and was accepted as a woman into a female domestic violence center would subject that person to some of the things that this bill tries to prevent. Your objection is not to the intent, but because you believe your funding is tied to a higher power that requires you to allow that?
My core objection is to the requirements of the funding, which are very clear. And they do clearly state that an individual is to be served based on their gender identity. So yes, that is our primary concern. Our other concern is the inability of us to house somebody who really needs it at that exact moment because we've pre-designated rooms for male or female.
Do you allow male victims of domestic abuse in your domestic abuse centers?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Is that very common?
No, it is very uncommon.
How uncommon?
I would say in a domestic violence shelter, you might have 1 to 2 per year.
With a population of how many in a year?
Where you would typically
I'm looking for percentages, what I'm trying to arrive at.
Maybe 1% to 2% in terms of actually needing shelter. And it's not, we know that there are male victims of domestic violence and we serve them, but they are less likely to be victims and they are less likely to need shelter if they are victims. So we just don't see as many.
If a male victim comes in, is there any special arrangements that are immediately taken to protect the female?
They get a private room. Yes, sir.
Residents?
Yes. So they're already not housed with any female residents in a shared room. Typically, they're also offered the opportunity to be housed off-site. So you can do scattered site shelters, which is basically a hotel or a motel stay, if that is what the victim desires. And usually it is.
Have you ever heard of any domestic violence center being denied funding from the federal government because they choose to not allow males who identify as females into the center?
Yes, their HUD is the most recent one to do in terms of federal funders. HUD is the most recent and kind of the most, they have the strongest requirements in terms of gender identity. And so again, they did not come in and pull anybody's money, but they said, we are requiring that you serve everybody based on gender identity and you cannot serve them in separate accommodations. Like you can't make every male go to a hotel just because he is a male, for example. And there were shelters that said, we're not able to do that at this time. We don't have the policies in place. And so they simply were not eligible for HUD funding and they stopped getting it.
And what percentage of your, if you can say, I'm sure it depends on different centers, but what percentage of your funding comes from HUD funding?
The HUD funding adds up to currently $8 million. I have a spreadsheet. $8 million.
Statewide?
Statewide, $8 million from HUD, another $2 million from HHS, which has similar wording, and another $2 million from OVW, DOJ.
Were you aware that the federal government is about to implement rules? They've given notice of rules for education, and particularly Title IX, that will require determination of of gender identity rather than biological identity of individuals for facilities in schools and athletics and things like that? Or were you familiar with, sounds like you've already been touched by similar rules.
We are already subject, in domestic violence shelters, we're already subject to those rules because we're not, we're kind of a different entity than education settings and things like that. But we already are required, it says an individual is placed, served, and accommodated in accordance with the gender identity of the individual. An individual is not subjected to intrusive questioning or asked to provide anatomical information or documentary, physical, or medical evidence of the individual's gender identity. So we didn't write them, we didn't create them, but we are required to follow them, and we've been doing it, and nobody has been harmed. It's been okay.
How long have you been doing that?
Since 2016.
Thank you.
We have a question from Representative Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, two things. One, just to be clear, when you say we don't house men and women in the same room, you're not saying you don't house, you could, in theory, house a biological woman and a biological male who identifies as a woman in the same room.
We could, theoretically, and we would not know. We don't check their pants or anything.
Right, but in a domestic violence shelter, I mean, if we're talking about the emotional, physical well-being of women who are victims of domestic abuse, I mean, to me that raises many concerns. Can you speak to that?
Yes. So what I can say is that every domestic violence shelter, like I said, they're staffed 24/7. The staff have been very well trained on issues of trauma, on issues of congregate living. I mean, this is what they do for a living. And so in any situation, whether it's related to somebody's gender identity or any other issue, right, substance abuse, any erratic behavior, anything, if anybody has an issue with a roommate in a domestic violence shelter, that is addressed immediately on a case-by-case basis, and they're either separated or alternate accommodations are made.
Mr. Chair, can I ask the Attorney General to come up and maybe speak to this and get a little clarity from what the law says?
Let's do this. Let's let her finish, and then we'll call her back up if that's okay.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then before we go to Ms. Representative Edmondson, I would like Ms. Cassiopo to speak. That way, if she has any questions for you.
Okay, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of this committee, I'm Charmaine Cassiope, and I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Operating Officer for United Way of Southeast Louisiana. I'm here because, like many in the not-for-profit community, especially in our case, we're one of the largest funders of domestic violence programming within our 7-parish region. We work in very close proximity with the Louisiana Coalition to Prevent Domestic Violence, and we certainly have funded programs that a large portion of our budget expends dollars to ensure that we're protecting as many individuals and families that have been impacted by domestic violence as possible. I think it's fair to say that I am extremely privileged to have been working in the domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking area for my entire career with United Way. And in 2014, with the assistance of many on this very committee, we were able to make historic improvements in domestic violence. But I think it's fair to say I'm here today that my position is, because we work so closely, after having evaluated and talked to several of the domestic violence shelters within our region, the fact that there were no complaints, that they did not ask to be part of this legislation, concerned us in the fact that when evaluating what the requirements are for federal funding, that we could potentially lose these dollars. I know as a not-for-profit, despite the fact that we are providing millions of dollars in funding to help our centers, we do not have a mechanism to make up those dollars. And so today, I'm here asking you to make sure that with this legislation, while we don't oppose it, we just want to make sure that the unintended consequences that would put at risk the millions of dollars that are so essential. I think it's fair to say that when I began in 2014 the work in domestic violence, Louisiana ranked second as the most lethal when it came to domestic violence homicides. Because of your incredible courage and the commitment that you have made and the investment that you've made, Louisiana moved from the second most lethal to the fifth. Now, while we still have enormous challenges, we know that because we have been able to secure additional funding that has been essential to serve these centers, I just don't want us putting at risk and taking a giant step backwards, because every day many of us are on the front lines. We receive those calls and we try to work day in and day out with those centers to try to make available resources wherever necessary to ensure that every individual impacted by the horror of domestic violence is served adequately in those shelters.
Thank you. We have a question from Representative Edmonston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Carlson wanted to bring up the AG. Yeah, I wanted to do that too. I just want to read this and then she'll kind of know what to address. But it's my understanding that the federal government has repeatedly claimed that a state would lose federal funding under Title IX or some other federal law or regulation, and either one of you can address this. Time and time again, the courts have ruled against the federal government and upheld state policies that protect privacy for women. Louisiana already won such a lawsuit in Title IX in the context of public schools. I realize we're not talking about public schools, and the state would likely win on that precedent. So just you can comment, and then again, Chairman's going to bring up the AG to address that.
All right.
Either one of you?
I think that's more
for the AG.
legal question for the AG, and if we could bring Attorney General Morrell to the table. We need some legal advice, General.
Yeah.
Thank you. Liz Morrell, Attorney General. First of all, I want to say that I've volunteered at a battered women's shelter for 5 years. I worked inside the shelter, and I worked on the crisis line for several years outside the shelter after I had young children at home. So it is a real problem in our community. So I share that concern. I think that, I would say a couple of things. One, the regulation that my friend here is reading from also requires that post-admission accommodations be addressed, and that a recipient, a subrecipient, an owner, operator, manager, or a provider must take non-discriminatory steps that may be necessary and appropriate to address privacy concerns raised by residents or occupants as needed, and as needed update its procedures in accordance with the prior paragraph. So the reg actually it requires accommodating without discrimination based on gender identity, but it also requires accommodating other residents' needs based on their privacy concerns. So I think that, what I'm here to tell you is that if your funding is threatened, I will defend it. I will defend anybody whose funding is threatened, and I will write to the governor and ask the governor to put funding in the budget to backfill it if that funding is threatened. I believe that funding is appropriate and it's necessary, and I don't think that the shelters should lose their funding, and we need to stand up by providing that funding if they're being threatened by the federal government, and then we need to go fight the federal government to stop them from taking it based on trying to we should be able to protect both biological women and anyone who identifies as a woman and is being threatened by domestic violence. Domestic violence is not something that just threatens women. It also threatens men. It also threatens young people who may not be in a marital or a family relationship. And so I've worked with some of these kids. I've walked through and gotten protective orders for some of the young women. I think that, and I've seen men that have been accused who were needed help too. So it's a problem. We need to support the funding for the shelters. We need to put our money where our mouth is. And then we need to go fight these policies so that we can have rational means of addressing the needs of the population. I don't think anybody here is suggesting that we should put anyone in danger. But we're also saying that we should be able to protect biological women and have privacy rights that are protected for those women. So I think if the bill needs to address some mechanism to make sure that those spaces can have neutral zones that are non-designated sex areas, bathrooms, dressing rooms, or somewhere like that, that's fine. I don't think anybody's actually opposed to that. But we should also be able to provide for areas that are protected areas that protect the privacy of biological women and biological men.
And it's early in the process, and I think we'll get it right. We have a lot of smart legal minds like you and other people that will get together. So we appreciate you. We do have a question from Representative Larverdane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Attorney General, if we pass this law the way it is, will it be in violation of federal law?
I don't think so, because of the provision that also requires them to accommodate the privacy rights of a resident who's in the shelter. So the reg is saying don't discriminate on the basis of gender identity, but it's also saying make sure you protect the privacy rights of other residents in the facility. That means someone is a biological woman who may say, I think you're discriminating against me. So I don't believe that it violates this reg. But I have seen, the federal government is in some places pressing these issues, and if they threaten the funding, then I'm prepared to help them defend it.
Okay. So we're somewhere in this gray area, is that about right? We're in the gray area, you would say?
I don't think it is a gray area.
Okay. So this bill says that a biological male shall go to a biological male bathroom. Biological female should go to a biological female. Is that correct? Restroom?
I think that
that's what the interpretation.
I think it requires that they designate those spaces for men and women.
Okay.
And sleep rooms.
Ma'am?
And sleep rooms.
And sleep rooms, okay.
But y'all doing that now. Y'all are doing
So
that
I didn't hear anything that they said that puts them in violation of the law. So they are accommodating both, and they are doing it in a way that attempts to protect all the individuals who are there, because they are coming there as victims of trauma. So they're coming in needing certain, there may be biological women who don't want to share a space with another biological woman. Domestic violence it's not exclusively between men and women either. So, you can have that trauma occur in different ways. And I know that the shelters work very hard to address the needs of someone who comes into the shelter. But I think that they are doing that, and they are balancing the needs to protect people. Sometimes those shelters can be crowded, they can be full. And I think that if there is some need to have an amendment that allows that if there's some question about whether they can have a neutral space to allow for unisex bathroom or changing area or something like that, that's fine. I don't think anybody's opposed to that. But you ought to be able to protect private areas for biological women.
I agree.
I've got some more. In a woman's shelter, can we put some type of signage where we can know that this is a private area? Is that appropriate? Yes, ma'am,
Yes.
you can answer.
There already are. So if there is a bathroom, for example, that is to be used by multiple people, to say it's in a hallway or something like that, there are already signs on that saying, one resident at a time in this restroom, those types of things. So those are already addressed.
And then you have some restrooms where you have a single restroom where it has male and female, meaning just anybody can go in there. Is that correct?
Yes, anybody could go in there, but like I said, the shelters are staffed 24/7, and so those areas are monitored.
Okay. The young lady in the blue, how much resources do we get from the federal government in regards to the shelter? How much does your program get a year?
Well, I don't receive, I'm a funder.
You're a
As
funder.
United Way of Southeast Louisiana, we
Do you receive any money from the federal government?
We do not receive money
Okay.
from the federal government, no. We supplement the resources that our shelters receive as a leading not-for-profit to be able to accommodate the increased necessity for housing victims of domestic violence.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we have a question from Representative Taylor.
Good morning, and I'd like to thank the Attorney General for assisting me in understanding exactly what's going on. And I know there's a great need for this type of service. Well, where is the funding coming from? Is all of the funding coming from the federal government for your facilities?
About 90%.
Okay. And so there is a great need for these facilities, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
All the testimony I heard today said there's a need.
Yes, ma'am.
So the legislation should be friendly towards the facilities. We shouldn't legislate based on speculation or innuendos about what might happen, because I too am a female and I'm very concerned about protecting girls and women, etc. But at this time, there is a great need for this facility.
Yes,
correct? And we should not do anything to jeopardize the funding of this facility based on speculation or innuendos, correct?
That is my hope.
So if we can work together as a group and try to bring legislation that would not defund this program but would assist in protecting other people, I think that's something that should be a goal that we work towards.
I agree, and I'm very open to discussing it further and to figuring out some language that would allow all of us to just do our jobs and not get caught up in a fight that we didn't need to be in.
And I heard a consensus also that these are the most vulnerable people at this time, and that's another reason why we should work together to try to put something in basis, not defund the program or legislate rules that's going to defund the program when there's a great need for the program. That's what I'm hearing.
Yes, ma'am.
So my statement on my questions is that I hope we can work together to pass this legislation that will not adversely affect the great need in the community that we need at this time.
Well, Representative Taylor, I just want to go on record as thanking you very much for those comments, because I think all the good work that we have done in domestic violence over the years since I've been a leading advocate in this area, I can tell you it's been done in a strongly bipartisan fashion with individuals working together to gain the kind of unanimous consensus that's allowed us to prioritize where we need to. So I can't thank you enough. And United Way of Southeast Louisiana stands ready to work with anybody to ensure that we do not lose the critical funding that allows us to serve the maximum constituency need that is out there every single day. Thank you.
Question from Speaker Pro Tem Johnson.
Ms. Wineski?
Wineski, yes, sir.
Okay. You're not running a shelter. You're over an organization.
Right.
Okay, so you wouldn't be able to answer the question of how, in practical terms, the passage of this law would actually change the operations of a center, if at all.
I am very familiar with how the shelters run. We train all of the folks that work at those shelters, and it would affect each shelter differently because each shelter has a different physical setup.
But if you're already saying that you're protecting the privacy and safety of each person there by individualizing, how would this law really, I understand there's concern about funding, but how would it actually change the operations from the way it's being done right now?
So if there is a requirement, so the bill does require that rooms be designated for males, females, as defined in the bill, right? Biological male, biological female, or families. I think those are the three options in the bill. And so it would change, it would have the biggest effect on the very small shelters where, like I described earlier, where they have 3 bedrooms, for example. And so one of those bedrooms would have to be designated for the use of males.
Okay.
And then when that male leaves, that room sits empty until the next male comes.
That's how you read this bill, is that it permanently designates it that way forever and ever?
It would have to be designated. I mean, if we can redesignate it when everybody leaves, then that's fine.
Okay.
I'll designate it based on whoever's in there.
All right,
You
so
can't
it
just put
sounds
a
like it's a
sign.
workable, it doesn't change the operation significantly. I mean, you're already trying to individualize. There's some testimony makes it sound like it will shut down these shelters if we pass this law, and I haven't heard that. But I want to thank our Attorney General, as once again, she's speaking up for, I think, what is the common sense. And I just want to thank you for agreeing to defend, your commitment to defend and protect the privacy and safety of women. And I thank you for the commitment to defend these centers if any effort is made against them. You give great steps as to why you believe your opinions about our adherence, passage of this law would not affect the funding. But I'm going to ask you, does it not, your opinion also, is it not supported by the jurisprudence on those cases where states' policies have been in conflict with federal mandates? Haven't most of the courts supported the state policies to protect women's privacy and women's rights?
They have, and I think this regulation recognizes that there's a privacy interest that has to be balanced. So, I can't tell you that there won't be a threat. I've seen, those threats made, but I can tell you that I'm committed to supporting them and fighting for their funding, and that I think that this body should be committed to making sure there's no gap in that funding while we fight in the event that there is some restriction by the federal government. I mean, we have to be willing to fight these fights. We've got to be willing to take it to the government and say, this affects us, it hurts us, and we think it's legally wrong. And then we can get an answer. But, we see these regulations come out, and until somebody's actually affected by them, we can't necessarily challenge them. And so, I think that if there is a threat, then I'm willing to fight to protect them.
Right. And when we say regulations, we're not talking about a law passed by Congress. We're talking about individual departments that their director appointed and their groups come up with these policies or rules and they implement them. Is that not right?
Well, that is partially correct. I would say that when they pass a regulation like this in the Federal Register, it becomes administrative law. So it's their interpretation of the law, and it's their interpretation of their power to interpret the authority they've been given by Congress. And that's part of what we go litigate, is the question of, were they in fact given that scope of authority from Congress, or did they exceed that scope of authority they were given from Congress? And is this within the appropriate boundaries of the discretion that they've been given? If it is, and if they can change the terms of the grant, that's another problem, is that when we accept these grants, and these are shelters that maybe are the United, I'm not sure who all has accepted the grant, who's implementing the grant. That's part of the question here. But there's always a question of how the government is changing the rules of the game as we go forward, and we're about to see that happen under Title IX. So I'm preparing to join that fight as well, because I don't believe that the government can take and redefine the meaning of words and change the meaning of law in the process. Congress can make laws. The administrative agencies can't, but they can implement the power that they've been given. And that's where some of the legal rub is.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I just want to remind the members, I'm going to start following this clock a little bit tighter because we've got a long day ahead of us, so please be mindful of the 3-minute rule. Representative Edmonston for a question.
You said that right before you called on me, didn't you?
Well, no, look,
I'm just
victim of
teasing.
circumstance.
No, I'm going to be very quick, Mr. Chair. Thank you. So, just real quickly, I echo the Attorney General. I thank you both, in addition to the AG, for being here. I, too, am absolutely recognizing that we have a major problem, and we need these shelters. And so, no one on this committee is against those shelters. We're just trying to figure out how to protect people's rights. I just have a question for you, ma'am. United Way. I hear you say that the federal government doesn't have anything to do with funding for United Way, or did I misunderstand you?
We're not receiving any federal funds currently. to provide funding to our shelters. The
But
shelters are getting
you do receive.
I do receive
Right.
funds, but
Not necessarily for this right now.
And goodwill of our community who believes in the tremendous work that we are doing at United
Right.
Way. They invest in our programs, and a large portion of those dollars that come in, because domestic violence has plagued so many of our communities, and we've been successful at making, magnificent strides in that area, we are committed to making sure that we supplement not only state funding, but federal funding, and we strongly advocate at the local, state, and federal level for all the funding possible to meet the growing demand for our services, because I just want to be perfectly clear, the need out there far exceeds available resources to accommodate individuals that are desperately seeking the relief they need.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry.
Representative Edmondson, I would just point out that state agencies participate in raising money for the United Way. We all do that, and it's the generosity of individual state employees who are
didn't know
giving to
that.
the United
Yeah.
Way. And
Okay.
there's a big United Way campaign that runs across state agencies, and they do good work across the community, and we try to help raise money for the United Way.
Thank you so much.
God
Thank you,
bless
Mr.
you for
Chair.
that.
Representative Larverdane for a question.
Thank you. Real quick to the Attorney General. My concern is that if we need to tweak the language in the bill, let's try to do that between now and the floor, because I don't want to get in a match with the federal government and they suspend services, and then the state has to pick up those resources. Then the state say, well, I don't know if we can do that. So I don't want to be in violation of federal law, but if we can tweak the language, work with the with Rep. Wilder, let's tweak the language so we do not put any jeopardy to those funds that are coming from the federal government. We don't want to be in violation, and we don't want to spend 4 or 5 years fighting the federal government. That's money we don't need to spend. I know you want to fight, but you're fighting with public money. I don't want to just throw money away like that. So if we can tweak the language, let's work it out, and let's get it so it'll work for everybody, because I'm concerned about the domestic violence groups, because they're struggling in my area in Alexandria. We've got a small group, but they're struggling. They're constantly asking for resources, and my community is struggling. So before you pick a fight, let's see if we can get some language so we won't have any problems with the federal government, because if they suspend the money, then we're going to be forced to pick up the tab. And with money in the next 3 or 4 years, we may not have it. So can you do that for us?
Happy to work with people. I think that I agree with you that we don't need to spend money that's unnecessary to spend. I also think that we need to fight for our values. So I believe we can do both of those things, and I'm certainly happy to work with these fine people and the author to see if we can find some acceptable middle ground.
And you've got some connections in D.C. Work the language out so we won't have to fight with the federals. We don't want to do that. That's a waste.
do the best we
They've got a ton of money. We don't have that kind of money.
Well, they print money.
Well, we've got to have a budget. They don't have a budget. Thank you.
We don't. They do.
Thank you very
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, now we're going to take the red cards. If we could clear the table. John Faria, representing herself. Elizabeth Loop, representing herself. And Melissa Flournoy, 10,000 Women. And feel free to go in any order and just introduce yourself to the committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Jean Faria. I've been a practicing attorney in the state for 40 years, and I'm here in opposition to HB 608 for the following reasons. The American Academy of Pediatrics has weighed in on the language in similar bills in other states, stating that these definitions are scientifically inaccurate, as this language is not inclusive of people with chromosomal variations, such as intersex people, or people with diverse gender identities, such as transgender or non-binary people. Research shows that sex can be more complicated than just male or female. Sex chromosomes can indicate one thing, anatomy can indicate something else, and other genetic factors can play a role. For transgender, non-binary, or intersex people having identification that is incongruent with their identity can open them up to discrimination and possibly subject them to violence in unsafe situations if they're outed, as in a transgender woman being in a male bathroom. As the mother of a transgender adult professional woman, I am deeply concerned that this bill will subject my daughter to unsafe situations and violence. As a tax-paying citizen of this state, I am deeply concerned about the more than likely loss of federal funding associated with this bill. And while I have great respect for the Attorney General, my colleague, I disagree with her interpretation of what may very well happen in this state and in this country. And in states where similar bills have been filed, nonpartisan fiscal analysts have estimated the loss of federal fundings from the United States Department of Education, which has gone back and forth, and the Department of Health and Human Services to be anywhere from $2 billion in the state of Tennessee to $7 billion in the state of Montana. In addition to the loss of federal education and health dollars, this law could result in the domestic rape and violence crisis centers, which we have heard about, which is a major concern as well, and forcing them out of compliance with anti-discrimination rules. We talk a lot in the state about the loss of population and the brain drain, and have been frequently referenced in this building as well as in our local and state media. And I would suggest to you that legislation like this is a contributing factor to the decision of some of our young people to leave Louisiana. Thank you. For these reasons, I am asking this committee to vote no on this bill. Thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you. Welcome to the Capitol. Whoever wants to go next. Ms. Flournoy, you want to go next?
Liz, okay, thank you. Good morning, members of the committee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on this bill. My name is Elizabeth Loop. I was born and raised in Louisiana, and I've lived here for all but 2 years of my life. I obtained my JD at LSU Law, and I've spent the past 5 years practicing as a criminal defense attorney. It probably won't surprise any of you to learn that I am a transgender woman. I'm here to tell you why this bill will make women and men unsafe, not just in the transgender community, but across a wide array of people. I'm certain everyone on this committee has already considered the harm that this bill will do to trans women who will be forced to use men's restrooms in important public facilities. I am particularly concerned about transgender children, whom this bill will force into bathrooms at odds with their gender. The American Medical Association has repeatedly warned against the policies being proposed in this bill and has said that discriminatory bathroom bills affecting transgender school children, quote, threaten to exacerbate the risk of anxiety and depression, low self-esteem, engaging in self-injurious behaviors, suicide, substance use, homelessness, and eating disorders, among other adverse outcomes. End quote. We've discussed trans women fairly thoroughly, but utterly ignored in this conversation has been the existence of transgender men, women who transition to male. It is common for trans men to use testosterone as part of their hormone replacement therapy as they transition, and this has all of the effects you would expect. They have increased muscular growth. They develop facial hair. Their voices deepen. In some cases, they experience male pattern baldness. Many transgender men have mastectomies to remove breast tissue or bind breast tissue so it is not visible. And as a result, many are completely indistinguishable from other men, barring intrusive and frequently illegal examination. This bill will force these men, again, frequently indistinguishable from other men, into women's bathrooms, where they will be in serious danger of arrest or violence. Lastly, I want to talk about the largest group of people this bill will endanger. The women this bill claims it will protect. Many women who have not transitioned, who have bodies that produce ova, are very tall, or have deeper than usual voices, or are extremely muscular, or have a masculine body. Many women cut their hair in a short, masculine style. Many wear masculine clothes. There are already reports throughout the country of women The very same women this
I need
bill
you to
claims to
wind up.
protect being assaulted for being in the wrong bathroom simply because they do not fit outdated ideas about what a woman should look like.
All right. That was 3 minutes.
Thank you.
Ms. Flournoy?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm Melissa Flournoy. I'm the board chair of 10,000 Women. And I'm here today to say that I think the Women's Safety and Protection Act is a list of definitions that already exist in law and is not necessary. The premise is that biological men are dangerous to all women. And yes, some men are dangerous. But I do not know of one reported instance in the state of Louisiana where a biological woman was accosted by a transgender woman in any facility, bathroom, dorm, shelter, or correctional facility. I do think we need to be aware and careful of how we all treat all people humanely. I think our shelters, schools, domestic violence shelters, correctional facilities, stores, and every other accommodation should make appropriate accommodations on a case-by-case basis to respect the rights of all citizens of Louisiana. I do know several young professionals who are transgender. I know several people who were assigned female at birth and now live their lives and identify as male. These young people are so smart, talented, competent, graduated from Louisiana schools, and unfortunately have moved out of state. They worked with me at Louisiana Progress, worked here at the Capitol, and interacted with many of you over the last several years. They presented as fine young men that you were proud to know. They were careful, competent, and considerate. But this legislation would have forced them to use the women's restroom across the hall. I don't know what is more frightening, forcing young men with beards in blazers and khaki pants and loafers into the women's restroom, or just letting people go to the restroom they feel most comfortable in. There are several advocates who are transgender women that will be here today. They're in the Capitol often, wearing dresses, pearls, heels, looking very lovely. You may have been in the bathroom with the transgender woman already. They would be forced to use the men's restroom. Some of you women legislators may not even realize that those women are transgender. I did a Google search to try and find out if there were instances of transgender people committing crimes in changing rooms and related locations, and if there was a need for this legislation. As far as I could find, transgender people in Louisiana are most likely to be victims of crime. I can just imagine forcing some transgender women to go into the men's room. That would be endangering their personhood and letting people interfere with them. I believe we need to recognize that there are transgender people in Louisiana. We need to hear their heartfelt stories, and we need to recognize their humanity and do no harm. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to the Capitol. Next, we have Sarah Guidry and Britton Forsyth. Sarah Guidry or Britton Forsyth? We'll see if they're across the hall. Give them a minute to. Britton Forsyth. Ms. Guidry, you want to testify?
Sorry, we were in the hallway. I apologize.
Welcome to the Capitol.
Thank you, representatives. Apologies for the delay.
Whoever wants to go first.
Okay. Dear honorable members of this
Introduce
committee-
yourself for the record.
Apologies. My name is Sarah Jane Guidry. I'm the executive director of the Forum for Equality. We're the statewide LGBTQ human rights organization. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to address you today on a matter of profound significance to our community here in Louisiana. And I'm voicing my strong opposition to House Bill 608. This anti-transgender, what some would call bathroom bill, but facilities bill, seeks not only to marginalize but erase the very existence of non-binary, gender-expansive, and transgender individuals here in our state. At its core, this bill represents a deeply troubling attempt to deny the humanity and dignity of an already vulnerable population. By seeking to eliminate legal recognition of gender identities beyond the binary, HB 608 exasperates the discrimination and challenges faced by transgender and non-binary individuals. It sends a harmful message that their identities are neither valid nor worthy of respect, further entrenching the prejudices that fuel violence, harassment, and systemic inequality, such as this bill. The implications of this bill are far-reaching, affecting not just access to bathrooms in public facilities, but the very safety and well-being of transgender Louisianans. It forces individuals into spaces that are at increased risk of assault, bullying, and psychological harm. It contravenes the values of inclusivity, respect, and compassion that should define us as a society. Moreover, such legislation has been shown to have severe detrimental effects on mental health within the transgender community, leading to higher rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide, especially among our youth. Just over 1 out of every 4 students in the Harvard study, or 25.9%, reported being a victim of sexual assault in the past 12 months. Transgender and non-binary teens were subject to restroom or locker room restrictions, had an even higher prevalence of sexual assault at 36%, according to these findings. The rates of sexual assault for non-trans U.S. teens, those whose gender identity matches their sex assigned at birth, is 15% for girls and 4% for boys, according to the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey administered by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. In conclusion, I urge you to consider the profound negative impacts that have already been highlighted by many others here today, and how it would affect our state and its people, and especially our transgender community. This bill does not protect anyone, rather it puts our most vulnerable at greater risk and stands in opposition to the principles of justice that should be guiding our legislative efforts.
Ma'am,
I implore you to stand.
We have a 3-minute rule in effect, and so your time is up.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Britton Forsyth. I hope you'll excuse my disorganized testimony. I do not work here, but I come here as an advocate around education issues and economic issues, but today I'm testifying on behalf of myself. I appreciate the committee for having us today and listening to us. I come here to the Capitol, and I work on a wide range of issues, and usually as a person who just does policy in the background and helps out folks testifying. But I also come to this building as a trans man, and I'm incredibly concerned about this bill. I think the public school portion is scary for a lot of kids. Trans kids have a really hard time in school already, and to be honest, going to the bathroom for them specifically is really scary already. Of course, the incarcerated portion, I hope someone else is here who has the data in front of them, but trans women who are incarcerated are at an extremely high risk of violence while incarcerated, and many sheriffs have taken to an individualized approach for dealing with each person who's incarcerated as they come, if they identify as trans, and figuring out the safest ways to house that person. Domestic violence shelters obviously scares me. Trans women specifically are at a very high risk for interpersonal violence and intimate partner violence. And if we pass something that makes it harder for them to get into domestic violence shelters, it could be deadly for a lot of them. I also want to close my remarks by saying I am not the only trans person who works in the Capitol as an advocate. There are quite a few of us. Some of us work on trans issues. Some of us work on things that many would say are completely unrelated. All of us are very happy to work with the author and any legislators on bills that impact our community and are very ready to have calm and informed conversations about, ways that everybody can get their needs met. So I'm making myself available for that. I'm here all the time. I'll try to find Rep. Wilder when I can. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your testimony. We have a question from Representative Chenevert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to say, I guess, tell me your name again. I'm sorry.
Sarah Jane.
Sarah. So, in listening to this, do you think that it is appropriate for my 10-year-old daughter, a friend's 8-year-old daughter who swims, my daughter swims on a swim team, do you think it's appropriate that they should have to go unrobe and get an undress in a dressing area with young men?
So my answer to that is that we're not asking them to unrobe with young men. We're making sure that all students of their gender identity are respected. Doesn't necessarily mean that what you're saying would happen. I also am a mother. I have a 16-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old daughter. And so I can answer that as a person that has children, that does not concern me. And I do know that most schools, when working with transgender students, work on policies that individually match that student and their safety. And so I would definitely say that is a policy that lots of schools, you can go to Orleans Parish and their school board and see how they handle those situations. So I think that we're not necessarily asking the same question because we're not necessarily, they're not asking young girls and young boys to unrobe in the same room.
Right. Well, I want to respect your answer. I never like to cut anybody off. My question, I do think that you're not answering the question because if there is a biological male 10-year-old who swims with my child, and they are required a bathroom is required, a public area is required to allow that child who identifies as a female, they would be in the same locker room. They would be in the same room. And so what this legislation does, I don't think it harms a child if we're just saying you need to change with your biological anatomy. And so here's my concern. There are many little girls out there. And when I speak on this issue, I also played sports. The sports situation has been settled with legislation in Louisiana. So I'm not referring to that. But what this legislation does, we are simply saying that there is a biological male, biological female, and that we're going to have locker rooms, changing rooms, and bathrooms based on that. Anybody gets to use the bathroom, but we have to have some guardrails for our children. And so when we have this conversation about, I would find it that a lot of parents would be concerned that their child who's naked, who's 10, should not have to be naked with another biological child in a bathroom or changing room. And so this is not to harm any child, but this is to bring some common sense clarity of how I grew up, you grew up, I didn't have to change with the guys at all, playing softball, doing swim team. Never. And I think it's fair to make sure that we are allowing that same protection for all kids and for all people. And so my concern is...
Representative Chenevert, please wind up because we're going to...
I have one more question. It was mentioned that American Academy of Pediatrics and American Medical Association today, and I have great respect for those. How is it unsafe, and my last question for you, how is it unsafe that someone is supposed to go use a restroom based on their biology? Behind a closed door, using the restroom, how is it unsafe that they have to go into a room, a bathroom, that is a biological male, and one for a biological female? If you're I'm just asking this simple question.
All right, so you've got 3 minutes to respond, then we're done.
So Britton would like to answer if that's possible.
Is that okay with you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, absolutely. Listen, I hear your concerns. I understand that you're worried about your kid.
Not just mine, a lot of kids.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of kids.
I think, I think my motto is like, as I'm sure as a representative and myself as an advocate, I think all children of Louisiana are our kids and we have to take care of them. The kid that you're talking about that might have to change with your kid is also really scared. And if we separate things by the way sex is defined in this bill, that kid has to go change with the boys and is subject to some violence. And I mean, to be honest, I've been, I didn't come out as trans until later in life, but I knew when I was a kid, and I hated the changing room, and I really would have preferred just a private space for myself. But being put in, for that particular kid that you're talking about to be moved to the male changing room is really scary for them. Also, I have not come out as trans in this building until this hearing, so I have a pretty easy time using the bathroom in this building. But to be frank, like the fact that I came to this table and said that puts me at risk in the bathroom in this building. So I think my ask here is, I get that everyone is worried about kids. I'm also worried about kids. I'm asking that we also worry about trans kids because they are very scared. And I just want them to be safe, and I would hope that this body wants the same thing.
Well, I just thank you for your time, and I just want to say for the record that I think every child has great value, and our value was set as high above, and it doesn't matter what color we are, what gender we are, that we are valued because we are human beings. And so I just want to say that for record, and I'm grateful for your testimony, and I'm grateful for you for being here today.
Thank you. Welcome to the Capitol.
I just wanted to say with the 20 seconds left that highlighted in the Harvard study is exactly the thing that you're talking about and that Britton was highlighting, is that trans kids are more at risk of harm, 30% versus 15%, twice. So the bullying, the harm, the harassment is on the kids that are being the ones asked to move to different facilities, right?
Thank you.
Trans kids. So that's really the importance that's also, I think, not part of the conversation that we're having this morning.
Thank you. Welcome to the Capitol. The board is clear. We do have some cards in opposition but not wishing to speak. Alex Moody, Lift, Louisiana. Angelique Blossom, Louisiana Fair Housing. Rustin Lloyd, representing himself. Terry Landry Jr., SPLC Action Fund. All right, if we could have the author back to the table to close on his bill. Well, before you close, we do have some questions. Oh,
It's not a question. I just wanted to make a motion at the appropriate time to report with amendments.
it is the appropriate time. But we do have a question before that by Representative Weibel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be brief. Representative Wilder, in your bill, I've read it and I've understood it, and I don't know if this may be a question for the Attorney General. I have confidence you can answer it. There's nothing in here, I'm thinking as a dad of a daughter, like you are, and I think back raising my daughter, there's nothing in here preventing a parent from, there were plenty of times I had to take my daughter to a restroom or so, when she was younger, obviously, growing up. There's nothing in there that prevents that specific scenario, as a parent, you're taking your child into the restroom, whatever.
I'll defer if I'm not accurate, but nothing to my knowledge, no, sir, that changes from what you would do today.
Right. And then, if you're a parent of an individual with exceptionalities, we see parents caring for their children as adults because they have certain exceptionalities. There's nothing that would
No, I've actually checked into that with respect to the parent thing wasn't relevant, but the caregiver thing was. That's something I specifically addressed to ask if a caregiver had to go into a restroom or anywhere as such.
Okay.
It's still okay.
And my final, and we can, confirm this between here and the floor. You and I spoke. Obviously, I like the bill. I co-authored it with you.
Thank you.
We spoke about our universities, our colleges. They have co-ed dormitories and all. And there's nothing in this that would incur any additional costs to those institutions.
Rep. Weibel, no, sir. And pursuant to our discussion earlier this morning, I asked the exact question before we walked in here.
Okay.
It's the same as it is today, so.
Great. Honestly, I do think it's tragic and sad that we have to have your legislation, but here we are. And I think it's necessary, and I think it's important. And I applaud you for bringing it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we do have a couple. You coming to the table has ignited some questions, so.
Okie dokie.
No, it's. I think it's Wilder. Representative Carter for a question.
You're familiar with United States Supreme Court cases relevant to this issue?
No, sir, I would not be, and I would gladly defer to the Attorney General.
Let me ask you this. Will this bill prevent a changed-sex child or adult that has changed its sex, had the surgery, and have done the whatever is required to be defined as a changed sex person, psychological treatment and medical treatment, hormone treatment. Will this bill affect those people from being able to go to a bathroom with the gender they identified? For example, if you're born male and you get a check change operation and you get the hormonal treatment and the psychological treatment that's required in most sex change operations, would you therefore be identified as a female, from male to female, or you still this bill prohibit you from using anything other than your birth sex?
Chairman Muscarello, may I invite the Attorney General back, please?
Absolutely.
Pursuant to the question being of a legal nature.
I mean, you probably dealt with this already. I just walked in, but I just want to make sure. From what I read the bill, it seems like you're requiring folks born at their birth sex to be determinative of what type of bathroom they're allowed to be used, and what type of housing we're requiring. Is that what we're doing, or are we doing something different?
Judge Carter, Representative Carter, I think that Louisiana law does provide a mechanism for someone who has gone through the entirety of that process to have their birth certificate changed.
That's right.
And if they've done that, then I think that this doesn't affect them. I mean,
okay. So
I think that.
But if they haven't gotten their birth,
faced a lot of other problems before they get to that point, and I think that's what's driven the bill.
but if they haven't gotten their birth certificate changed, they done everything else. I mean, they had their operation, they had the hormone study, they had the psychological study that is required, okay? And the standard of care in those cases, they would still be prohibited from using under this bill if they hadn't gotten the birth certificate changed.
I think this bill would require them to use the biological. But it wouldn't prohibit the creation of neutral territory either.
All right, so
Judge Carter, I know you've been gone, but I just want to remind you we're on the 3-minute rule.
Okay, thank you.
45 seconds.
I'm over 30 minutes. 3 minutes.
You're knocking on 3 minutes.
Okay,
but I'm gonna give you some leeway.
All right, give me. All right,
thank you.
There is a United States Supreme Court case.
There's a case on employment discrimination. there's a case on employment discrimination.
It deals with employment discrimination, but I thought it did provide for same-sex people to have completed the required. It allowed the state to set up the criteria, finally, and there's some national criteria. But once you complete that criteria, then you can use the other sex bathroom if it's completed. This bill wouldn't affect that.
I think the case that you're talking about is the Bostock case. There's the only one that I'm aware of that went to the United States Supreme Court, and it dealt with employment discrimination. So that's all it really addressed specifically. So I think that.
Okay, well, I'll just deal with it later. But thank you for answering my question.
Thank you. We have one more question by Representative Taylor. Well, let me get you.
The domestic violence, excluding them from this bill, is that a part of the amendment? Because he said the motion was to make it with amendments. Is
No,
this going to be included?
it's not a part of the amendment. The amendment is not to do with domestic violence.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, the board is clear. Representative Wilder, to close on your bill.
I think we've discussed plenty enough, and my opening covered most of it. I would just ask for favorable passage, please.
Okay. We have a motion by Representative Carlson to report House Bill 608 as amended. Any objection? Seeing no objection, the House Bill 608 is reported as amended. Thank you, Representative Wilder.
Thank you, committee, and thank you, Chairman.